webinar. So hi everyone again, for those of you who have just joined us. I'm Victoria Herman. I'm the Managing Director of the Arctic Institute and the Principal Investigator of the National Science Foundation funded Research Coordination Network that is hosting this webinar. Our research network, Migration in Harmony, aims to bring everyone from traditional knowledge holders to geologists, cultural heritage practitioners to public health workers together to jointly prioritize what research needs to be done in Arctic migrations. And today we have invited Dr. Andreas Østhagen to come and talk about how fisheries are moving north and what that means for Svalbard as a fisheries hub, the blue economy, and generally how policy has to react to this further migration north. Throughout this webinar, I will be monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions logistically or questions to Andreas, please put them in the chat because we will be moving from his presentation to a robust question and answer discussion afterwards. Once Andreas is finished with his presentation, we will come back together and we will have a discussion where you have the opportunity to either turn on your video or unmute yourself and ask Andreas questions about his presentation or all things Arctic fisheries. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Andreas Østhagen is one of the original members of the Arctic Institute. He is currently on our leadership team and is a senior fellow. He's also a senior research fellow at FNI, and he is an affiliated fellow at the High North Center at Nord University. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Andreas.
Excellent. Thank you, Victoria. I'm glad you're recording this so we can spread the happy message about Arctic fisheries to millions and millions of people on YouTube. So I'll be talking about, Victoria mentioned it, the wide topic of Arctic fisheries. That can mean many different things. Just to kind of follow up on Victoria's introduction of myself, I'm from the Norwegian Arctic, the beautiful town of Bodø. If you haven't been, it's maybe Arctic light because it doesn't get that cold in the wintertime in Bodø. And actually growing up in Bodø, you didn't really reflect on it, at least not as a child and later on as a youth. But Bodø was founded because of fisheries, right? Because of the herring that shifted patterns of movement further north, and then eventually that led to a booming industry in Bodø that then led to the city itself growing, and then today being the second largest city in the Norwegian Arctic. So in the Norwegian context, fisheries in the north, in the Arctic, is extremely important. It is, without doubt, the industry that employs the most people. And if you go around the Arctic countries, you see the same patterns. It's at times the industry that employs the most people, but also often the most valuable industry. So although we tend to talk about oil and gas and shipping, etc., in the Arctic, even minerals, it's actually fisheries that has been the backbone of Arctic communities throughout history, and probably it's going to be so in the future as well. So Victoria mentioned I'm a senior research fellow at Fridtjof Nansen Institute, named after the polar explorer Fridtjof Nansen, who went up 100 years ago, trying to explore the Arctic. I'm based in Oslo, where unfortunately fewer people care about marine living resources. They of course care about it, but not being located along the Norwegian coastline, of course, means that you have less kind of a connection to the notions of fishing industry and the importance of this industry. So I'll touch a bit actually upon that. And just to kind of widen the focus a bit, I focused in my PhD on ocean politics and ocean governance. So I'll get to that at the end when we talk about Svalbard. But over the last couple of years, I've been part of a project that looks at how the various fish stocks, not only in the Arctic, but in certain parts of the world, are changing and what that means for the management of these fish stocks. As you all probably know, most, or at least a lot of fish is transboundary, meaning that they traverse across the ocean from one exclusive economic zone to the other, or even into the high seas, meaning that states are often not only, or often have to, but they often must collaborate on management of these fish stocks just in order to have a sustainable yield. And the management organizations around the world have actually just popped up over the last few decades. I mean, if you go back to the 60s, 70s, there were very few of them. And then over the last few decades, even more have arisen in various parts of the world as states have realized that they have to collaborate to have a sustainable yield, not do overfishing basically and have overexploitation of the stock. And then that again will lead to the stock being depleted or diminished. Because if you manage the fishery or transboundary fisheries sustainably, it's a, I guess, a forever lasting resource in many ways, right? It is a sustainable resource. It reproduces itself. So the project that I've been part of over the last couple of years has looked at 3 specific domains where this is rather relevant. One is the Barents Sea in the Arctic, so the ocean above Norway and the Russian mainland. And also the North Sea, which is just south, kind of crossing into the Arctic, but the sea that is shared between the UK, Norway, and Iceland and Faroe Islands. And then Antarctica. So although, I mean, Victoria and I and others on this call as well, Doris, is part of the Arctic Institute. I mean, the Antarctic, rather different from the Arctic, but still relevant when we talk about the impacts of climate change and fisheries. And if you look at these various maritime domains, I mean, I'm no expert on the physical location of the stocks. I'm a political scientist, right? I'm only studying how states respond to the stocks moving, not exactly where they're going. But there's no doubt when looking at the natural science evidence that stocks are being impacted, right, by climate change and by other changes as well taking place at sea. In the North Sea, we've seen a conflict or a dispute emerge over mackerel in particular, or mackerel. The mackerel stock is rather profitable, and herring as well, although that has been resolved. The mackerel dispute is still ongoing, perhaps a dispute that no one really talks about, or not much at least anymore. We tend to focus a lot on oil and gas disputes, like the one, for example, in the Eastern Mediterranean right now, but we talk very seldom about fisheries disputes, perhaps because states tend to keep them at a lower level. It doesn't tend to involve sending naval vessels, at least not often. But anyway, the point being that since 2006, 2007, we've actually had a mackerel dispute between Norway, the EU, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland, ongoing in the North Sea. Why? Because the mackerel changed its pattern of movement. So basically wandering further north and further west, so towards the Icelandic exclusive economic zone. And that led to a disagreement between these countries on how to best allocate quotas, and they still have not managed to agree on this. In the Antarctic, you see similar trends. It's not so much that the krill itself, which is the main thing that is being fished, is moving that much, but you see that there's emerging, at least talk, if not even dispute, perhaps even a conflict in the future, on how to best manage the marine living resources in the Antarctic. And quite a few of the Antarctic treaty partners have pushed for a moratorium, or MPAs as well, on some marine protected areas, or on fishing in certain parts of the Antarctic or the ocean around the Antarctic continent, although others are less inclined to agree with those. So you see kind of an erupting, if not conflict, then at least a dispute over how to best manage marine living resources in this part of the world as well. That is slightly related to climate change. And then in the Barents Sea, which is rather important in an Arctic context, because it is one of the parts of the Arctic that is ice-free predominantly throughout winter, and it's the home for the largest cod stock in the world, the Arctic cod, or the Northeast Atlantic cod, which is jointly managed by Russia and Norway, meaning there's fewer chefs in the kitchen, if you may. So I guess one of the reasons that in the North Sea countries had problems allocating quotas is to do that you had to agree between 4 parties, and one of these parties also being the EU, that then includes 28 now, 27 members. Whereas in the Barents Sea, you've seen a rather big effect of climate change on the movement of the cod stock moving further north, but you only have Russia and Norway that have to collaborate and agree to find a proper allocation mechanism and or a proper size of the total allowable catch, the total quota. So even though you've seen in the Barents case that the cod has been moving further up towards Svalbard, these two countries are still able to agree on the best total allowable catch. And that might also be related to the fact that the cod stock has been yielding quite a bit. So it's a very healthy stock, and it's been growing. The quotas have been growing, but also because the scientists are saying that the stock itself is also growing every year. Perhaps if the stock was declining, things would have been a bit different. And we saw that actually, if you look back into history, in the 90s, when Norway and Russia were trying to collaborate on setting the total allowable catch of cod, there were rather tense negotiations and conflictual debates about what the allowable quota should be, because the stock was, well, there were fears at least that the stock was being overexploited and it was about to collapse. But they managed to turn that around, which often has been hailed as an example of best practice on fisheries management. But then again, only two countries, although two countries with a long history of being on different sides in a security relationship. But okay, all this aside, I mean, we can debate perhaps later on, the factors that are leading to successful management of various fish stocks. It's an interesting question. I mean, there's no right answer per se. One thing that has become apparent in the studies that we've done at FNI and the Arctic Institute over the last couple of years has been that certain elements or certain factors that matter more than others, and certain things are becoming more prominent that weren't as prominent, let's say, a couple of decades ago. One thing is the use of science. I mean, I guess we're all aware that we're in the age where everyone is questioning science and facts. And this has actually also occurred when it comes to negotiations between states on how to set the total allowable catch or quotas. So various countries have their own scientists that have their own methods or own mechanisms to devise what's the total, or what's the biomass and what's the pattern or movements of the fish stock itself, which then leads to disagreement on the total size of the fish stock, and then also what the best quota should be like. So actually it's interesting that in fishery science, or the negotiations between various actors in fisheries, science is becoming slightly more disputed than it used to be. And then on top of this, you have the increased relevance, or perhaps not increased relevance, but awareness of relevance of fisheries in domestic politics. And if you just look at the Brexit negotiations, if you're wondering about how fisheries can play a symbolic role, because fisheries is less than 1% of the United Kingdom's GDP, but still it caused a lot of emotions and a lot of attention given to the Brexit campaign, taking back our waters, as part of the slogan. And you see this across the board, not only in terms of the UK and Brexit EU relations, but you see it when the mackerel dispute that I talked about, it comes to Iceland. You see it in the Norway-Russia settlement of the cod stock in the north, but also how it relates to the agreement on the maritime boundary in 2010, and how certain fishery actors were very unhappy, feeling that they were giving away rights in the Barents Sea. You see this across the board. So the role of domestic actors in using fisheries as a symbolic tool to kind of harvest political engagement, right? Because fisheries often are tied to, as I started talking about in this presentation, to the local communities, right? To the idea, the kind of historic notions of having people living in the most remote parts of the Arctic or the world in general, and how we kind of romanticize fisheries as an industry and fishery as an activity, and that again, how that's important for society and for states to protect. And thereby also you have to be hard in international negotiations over how to best allocate quotas, because you would like to bring as many tons as fish back home as possible, because that pleases the domestic audience at home. So these things are important aspects, and it relates to, so I'll be finishing soon, but it relates to Svalbard. and what Victoria also mentioned. So I'll touch on Svalbard in a minute. But one of the cases that we also looked at when trying to see the link between climate change, a changing Arctic, and management of marine living resources has been the snow crab. And you might not be thinking of snow crab on an everyday basis, which is perfectly fine. I still haven't tasted snow crab, only king crab. So I'm looking to taste some if anyone has some suggestions of where to buy it. But the point with the snow crab is that it's an introduced species in the Arctic. No one is quite sure yet where it arrived from. Perhaps it was put there by mankind, or it had a catch the ride with a boat or a vessel coming from somewhere else. But the snow crab coming into the Norwegian Arctic, or the Russian Norwegian Arctic, the Barents Sea, has been slowly kind of developing as a stock or as a species. And it's slowly also been wandering along the seabed further west. So coming from the Russian Arctic in the Barents Sea, now towards the Svalbard zone, or the continental shelf around Svalbard. And then you've had an issue with Svalbard and who has the right to do what on this continental shelf. And initially, a few EU fishers from Latvia and Lithuania, Poland predominantly, were rather interested in harvesting the snow crab. It was seen as this new golden resource, or a new gold mine for potential marine living resources, because it is multiplying rather fast, and the meat is savory. And I mean, if you've had king crab, you know what I'm talking about. But it caused conflict with Norway, because Norway claims and has the legal opinion that the continental shelf around Svalbard is not subject to the Svalbard Treaty of 1920, but it's basically a regular Norwegian continental shelf, and Norway has the exclusive right to resources on it, like any other state has on its continental shelf. Whereas the EU, or Latvia, Poland, Lithuania, pushing this issue towards the EU, and then the EU having to fight for this cause, because fishery policy is kind of a common policy within the European Union, has a different approach to it. And there again, in that small little dispute, which is still not settled, I think that the parties have agreed to disagree, you again see the role of the domestic audience in terms of a few domestic actors pushing for this small issue, which is rather minor. I mean, we're not talking about much money, and we're also not talking about a lot of fishers or a big industry. We're talking about a small issue, but it gathers domestic support amongst a few actors, both in Norway and in the mentioned EU countries. And on top of that, you also see disputes in terms of science, how to best deal with this new species in the Arctic, and what it also means in the future development of other species in the same area. And that takes us to Svalbard. So Victoria, in kind of the introduction to this seminar, and also online, was talking about the idea of Svalbard as a hub for fisheries. And it's a project that we have just started at FNI, basically trying to unpack the complexities of Svalbard and fisheries. Because if you've been to Svalbard, if you've been to Longyearbyen, the largest city or settlement on Svalbard, you would probably have, or you might have noticed that there's no processing plant for fisheries on Svalbard. And the fish basically that is being caught in the Barents Sea is being processed and being shipped further south to the Norwegian mainland, on the Russian mainland. And there's many reasons for this, mostly related to the Svalbard Treaty and the fact that the Norwegian government has not opened up for establishing a processing plant and establishing accepting the landing of fisheries on Svalbard. And over the last few years, there's been more and more talk in Norway in particular about using Svalbard as a hub for fisheries. Even the Norwegian Parliament have requested looking into this specific issue. And it also relates to what I just talked about earlier, the cod stock moving further north, further and further into the fishery protection zone around Svalbard. And also the snow crab that I just talked about as well. So suddenly you're seeing, because the fish is moving further north in the Arctic or the Barents Sea, you're seeing also the potential of Svalbard as a fisheries hub emerging on the radar, political radar, and to an extent economic radar as well among certain companies. But Svalbard is governed by a specific treaty from 1920. This treaty says that Norway cannot discriminate against nationals from the various parties to this treaty when it comes to economic activity. So if the Norwegian government were to open up for landing fish or snow crab in Longyearbyen and then eventually processing it and then shipping it off to markets somewhere else, perhaps Asia, it would have to allow for other countries or nationals of other countries to open up plants as well, as long as you follow the regulations set by the Norwegian government. And Norway cannot discriminate as well who can work in these plants. It's up to the various businesses. At least these are the initial ideas concerning the treaty and concerning Fisheries Hub. So we have a project though looking more deeply into this, looking into what are the certain criteria that have to be fulfilled. Are there actually companies interested in this, or is this just a pipe dream, a mirage? And will Norway even consider allowing this? And would it even be in the Norwegian government's or the state of Norway's benefit to allow it, given certain disputes when it comes to the fishery zone around Svalbard, and also given the fact that Svalbard is part of Norway and Norway is rather sensitive to what activity takes place on Svalbard, and also the kind of share of the Norwegian population versus non-Norwegians living on Svalbard. And these are issues we haven't dealt with yet. We're just starting with this project. So I'm just suggesting you'll tune in to the Arctic Institute and to FNI and have a look at what we're finding as we go along. As is research, no final results yet. So I think that's my initial comments, Victoria, and then we could have a debate, or I'm curious to hear if anyone else has opinions and thoughts about these issues as well.
Well, thank you so much for that expansive presentation. I think we have covered a lot of ground and ended up at Svalbard like any good conversation should. So for those of you on the call, please either let me know via the chat or raise your hand for you to come on and ask Andreas a question or to give some feedback on what he has said if you are also working in fisheries. So I don't see anyone yet, but please type those in or raise your hand. And I will take this first stab at asking a question as the moderator. So you are entirely focused on fisheries at the moment, or at least in this project on Svalbard. But I wonder, thinking about the history of industry and of development on Svalbard, are there past examples that you are looking to of what to do or what not to do, what to research further from past international, multinational business endeavors on the island? And if so, could you talk a bit about that history of Svalbard being this space where you have seen other extractive industries on the sustainable and less sustainable side, but also science and how that relates to the treaty, and if any of those are applicable to fisheries?
Yes, I mean, that was a big question. But by all means, if you've read any history of Svalbard, you'll be aware that the main rationale for the presence on Svalbard, the Norwegian presence, the Russian presence in Barentsburg, and even, the American presence. Longyearbyen, the main settlement, is not named after a Norwegian, it's named after an American. And it all had to do with mining, with coal mining predominantly. Before that even, Svalbard was used as literally as a hub for whaling. I don't think we're going back to whaling at the expanse that it happened in the 16th and 17th century. But it says something about kind of the focus on natural resources or marine living resources as well. But when it comes to coal on Svalbard, which has been important for the last century, I think it's rather clear that it has never been really a profitable venture. The Norwegian government has supported it quite a bit. I think the Russian government, and before that the Soviet Union, also subsidized its presence on Svalbard. And the presence on Svalbard has quite a bit to do with the geopolitical positioning in the Arctic, and being able to have a foothold of being present in the north, as you see across the Arctic countries, upholding various settlements that might not, be economically feasible, but it's important for other reasons, which is perfectly legitimate. But then over the last few years, coal industry has fallen from grace in many ways, also on Svalbard, and eventually the coal plants or the mining of coal on Svalbard is shutting down. So the Norwegian government has been looking to find new ways of retaining or getting people to live on Svalbard, Norwegians predominantly, and not trying to discriminate, but also it's something about it's part of Norway, and the Norwegian government would like to have a large percentage of Norwegians living in this part of Norway, which is the part that really makes us Arctic, right? I referred to Bodø earlier in this conversation. It's above the Arctic Circle, but Longyearbyen is really the Arctic part of Norway if you go by any other Arctic country definition. So within this quest to find new industries or new ventures, fisheries has come up, and that's why we're talking about it right now. But it might not be that fisheries is the way to go, or at least it has a lot of issues, legal issues, geopolitical issues, issues when it comes to who's going to work in these processing plants, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the Norwegian government has shifted focus a bit away from fisheries, away from coal, towards, as you mentioned, Victoria, science. And that's really been the focus of late. Science on Svalbard, and UNIS, the university center there, is growing and expanding and accepting, in particular, the natural science students and PhDs and postdocs, etc. So if you're interested, go to Longyearbyen, spend 6 months and enjoy the winter. But they've also focused more on satellite services, tourism. There's questions about the effect of tourism. Not right now in COVID-19 times. Hurtigruten was the first cruise ship in the world that was allowed to sail, and that didn't go well. But still, tourism is seen as perhaps also part of the future. So I think to answer, this is a very long answer to your question, but to answer if fisheries or if the Norwegian government is looking back towards the future, not back towards the past, when looking towards the future. I wouldn't say so. I would say I think the idea is now to reinvent Svalbard, to make it a modern Arctic hub, if it's not for fisheries, then for something else. But fisheries might also play a part in this, and I think there's room that it can coexist with the other industries that I mentioned.
Yeah, so maybe going off of that, David S.'s question is, how important do you think it would be for Svalbard to push for processing plants for fisheries on the island itself? Is that key? And then also, if you can talk a bit about the sustainability of creating a fisheries hub. So you mentioned whaling, which we all know is not incredibly sustainable from a non-indigenous whaling approach, and coal was also not terribly sustainable. So can you talk a bit about fisheries and sustainability on Svalbard?
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the Svalbard itself, that's probably where you've seen the most interest in developing something. And the Svalbard local community is very much demanding that the Norwegian government, if you're taking away the life of the community being coal, then you need to come up with new ways that you can sustain a society up there, which is also in the interest of Norway, but also for the people who live there. So the local community has indeed pushed for this. But again, there's all these questions about what might the effect be on the local community. I mean, you only have 2,000 people living in Longyearbyen, 2,600 in total across all of Svalbard. So if you were to if the Norwegian government actually see it as beneficial to open a processing plant or any such thing, a landing facility on Svalbard, who's going to work in this plant? What will be the regulations? And what might be the effect of the local community on Svalbard? If you've been to Longyearbyen within the last decade, you probably noticed the amount of people working in tourism that weren't there before, and all these things. I mean, it's not necessarily saying that it's a good or bad, but it will have an impact and effect in such a small community. And this is not a Svalbard specific issue, right? You see this across the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, the Alaskan Arctic, small communities suddenly rapidly having to change because of new industry or something changing, tourism in particular. So it's a very good question, what the effect might be. We're looking at that in this project later on, trying to do some studies and discussing with the people of Svalbard themselves. And the sustainability aspect is important, but I think it's important to note that when it comes to fisheries, the cod stock in particular, it is a sustainable fisheries. I mean, you could always, I guess, argue about certain practices of fisheries in general, but sustainability when it comes to fisheries really evolves around the sustainable maximum yield, right? So how much you're actually exploiting this stock. And the cod stock, as I said, has been managed rather well between Norway and Russia. And it's often hailed, as I said, as a best practice. So, and I mean, I come from the north and I tend to eat quite a bit of fish, or at least I'm trying to. And I always have a preference for cod or for whitefish in general, because I do believe that it is sustainably managed. And then you can always question, I mean, certain of the methods used, I guess, and then the industry, they're improving this as we speak. But it's rather different than from whaling.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, for those who are interested in those questions of migrant labor, of urbanization, of globalization, of Arctic local economies, we'll be having some other upcoming lectures with the University of Lapland and the Arctic Center there on migration from labor forces. So stay tuned for more on that. But in the meantime, Alexis has a question for you about what you mentioned on the different states of and takes on science, and that research is becoming increasingly politicized. So how much has this dynamic been recognized by actors, diplomats, politicians, researchers in your experience? And does the politicization of marine science help keep the fisheries mattering on the agenda, or is it taking a toll on cooperation? Do you think this tension has broader consequences on Arctic governance that you're seeing?
Yes, so the first question, are politicians or diplomats taking this serious? I mean, I think they are, but there tend to be, at least now I'm speaking as a scientist or a researcher who have just been doing interviews, but my impression is that there seems to be this, not ignorance, but at least this willing ignoring of other people's or other countries' position, and just, so when you argue along a certain scientific path, and you're saying, we should take action X because, science says so. And then the counterpart says, this science doesn't matter, it's completely irrelevant. And whether that's a negotiating tactic, and then eventually you end up somewhere in between, or whether these diplomats or these foreign ministries or ministries of trade and industry and fisheries, etc., if they actually have little regard for the science and the evaluations that have been made, that's difficult to answer. Very difficult indeed. It seems to me that, I mean, this idea about science being politicized is nothing new, but it seems to me that within Arctic studies, it's something that increasingly is gaining attention. We can talk about the continental shelf claims between Russia, Denmark via Greenland and Canada, right? And science there. We haven't seen that fully emerge yet. Or we can talk about other issues within the Arctic Council and other parts of Arctic cooperation, like how science is being used to argue for a certain position that is convenient for a government. So I think really this is an important space to watch. And I don't think, and unfortunately, I don't have very much belief in this idea that there is kind of a truth also when it comes to these things. I think that, yes, you might be able to discern certain patterns of the fish stock or the biomass of the fish, but as soon as you're bringing this into a social setting where you have to negotiate between countries, between diplomats, between various actors that have something, a stake in it, there is not really one optimal solution, right? You can't do game theory and then you're suddenly all fine when it comes to fisheries or when it comes to the continental shelf. You have to kind of give and take, and this is where diplomacy and social science comes in, which again, I'm a social scientist, so perhaps not a very revolutionary answer. So what was your second question, Victoria? Sorry.
My second question was, do you think that this tension has broader consequences on Arctic governance, and is it taking a toll on cooperation?
Yes, I guess I touched upon that as well in my rambling answer, but taking a toll on cooperation, I mean, we haven't seen it so much in the Arctic Council, have we? I'm no insider expert when it comes to the Arctic Council, but it's from the outside, it seems that despite some disagreements on the wording of climate change in the last meeting in Finland, where the US seemed to have been pushing for something else, beyond that, the working groups keep doing their good day-to-day work. Beyond that, I think we haven't really seen it yet. I think we've seen it, as I said, in the examples that I mentioned. I think we've seen it in especially the mackerel, the fishery dispute in the North Sea that links to the Arctic. I think we can talk about the dispute about shrimp between Greenland and Canada as well, which is not as in the same way, but still it's also relevant. We could talk about how to best deal with the Arctic basin or the top of the world, literally. I mean, they've reached a moratorium, great. There were some harsh negotiations going on there on kind of the science-based approach as well, where different countries were taking different stances. So far, I think it's been okay, helped by, as I said, in kind of the case by the cod stock in the Barents Sea, the fact that so far it's positive sum game, although not to talk about game theory, but it seems that everyone has something to gain from reaching an agreement. But if push comes to shove, it might be a different scenario.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think in some decisions around Arctic governance, it is less the diversity of believing in science or not believing in science, but how the intersection of political priority and science-driven decision-making abut each other. And in the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council, we saw a failure to come to agreement on black carbon pollution mitigation, primarily from the United States and Russia, because despite having that science-driven solution of reducing it for public health and environmental health, that did not align with political priorities of the United States and Russia. So I think less so on the fake news and questioning science, but how different actors are using that science and what it means for their other priorities in the Arctic.
Can I just follow up on that, Victoria, because I think it's an important point. And I mentioned Antarctica earlier, and I'm no expert on everything in Antarctica. There's a lot of people more knowledgeable than I am. But you've seen the same there when it comes to MPAs, right? Putting in place MPAs, where even Norway had a different approach to the question itself, where Norway argued for, I guess, a science-based approach, saying that we shouldn't just, put a blanket MPA on the whole area without actually knowing where the fish stocks are moving and how the kind of the science looks like. Whereas some other countries, and the EU included, not a country, but still, were pushing for just implementing an MPA period. And then even that was reported later on afterwards, that Greenpeace and others were reporting that Norway was one of the countries arguing against an MPA in the Antarctic. And the Norwegian government was very quickly out saying, no, we're not arguing against an MPA, but we're arguing a different approach when it comes to the use of science when putting in place this international agreement.
Yeah, and I think that there many examples of this, which is why you should join our network so you can continue the discussion on this that lasts beyond an hour. But for now, I'm going to ask Lauren Fields if you want to unmute yourself and ask Andreas your question.
Sure, thank you. Very interesting presentation. I was wondering, so you talked about the mackerel quota contention and the international cooperation between Russia and Norway on Svalbard. I was wondering how you see cooperation in the Svalbard area furthered in fisheries. You touched on this a little bit already, but to what extent are fisheries managed currently in Svalbard multilaterally, or is Norway setting a quota in this area? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's a really good question, because you're kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of the details that sometimes are being a bit overlooked when we talk about the Barents Sea and Svalbard. Because when it comes to the fishery protection zone around Svalbard, this 200 nautical mile zone, all the fisheries that is being done there has been, or the quotas for the fisheries being done there has been set by Norway and Russia in tandem, not for that specific zone, but for the Barents Sea in general. So Norway doesn't single out the fishery protection zone. It just treats the Barents Sea as one large domain where you have multiple shared stocks. The most prominent being cod that I talked about, but you have others as well, quite a few actually. And then you have the Joint Fishery Commission, the bilateral Joint Fishery Commission between Norway and Russia that meets once a year and then sets, new regulations on how to improve fisheries, but also sets the annual quotas on these various stocks. So then it really doesn't matter for, I guess, for a fisherman perspective, just on the top of it, it doesn't matter if you catch the cod or the other types of fish in the Norwegian exclusive economic zone, in the Russian exclusive economic zone, or in the fishery protection zone around Svalbard, because it's all part of the same shared area. So Russian fishermen can easily go into Norwegian zone and vice versa, although they tend not to do so, and that's other reasons for language. And when you go to the Russian economic zone, you have to deal with the Russian Coast Guard and the Norwegian Coast Guard in the Norwegian zone, which if you speak Norwegian or Russian, there's issues there. But what we are seeing is that more and more of the fisheries, Norwegian but also Russian, is taking place within the fishery protection zone. Same quota, shared quota, but because the stock is moving further north, more and more of fisheries is also taking place within this zone, which doesn't, on the face of it, doesn't cause any issue, right? Because as I said, it's all a shared maritime domain. But you do have some issues at times arising when it comes to the Russian interpretation of Norway's authority in this zone, and Russia responding at times critical to the Norwegian Coast Guard arresting Russian fishers in this zone. So then suddenly you get the whole dispute over the Svalbard fishery zone on the agenda, although the stock itself is not really the issue then, it's more the Svalbard issue at hand. So but it's an important question, it's an important distinction when we talk about the Barents Sea and Svalbard.
Right, speaking of specifics, Marta has a question. If from your perspective, is there any possibility for the agreement of on mackerel's tax, so total allowable catches between total coastal states? Why is it so difficult for them to agree and harvest mackerel, herring, and blue whiting sustainably? And do you think that the Svalbard hub would help further that agreement?
Yeah, that's the nut to crack. If I knew that, I would probably be hired by the Norwegian Ministry of Fisheries. I haven't followed the debate this year. I'm not sure if COVID has any impact on it. But from what I can tell, it seems that it's difficult to reach an agreement. They haven't done so in a decade. I'm not sure it's going to happen anytime soon, but then again, they might be able to land some large multi-year agreement, as they did with the Faroe Islands rather early in the dispute, because the Faroe Islands was also in a dispute and outside the total allowable catch when it was only the EU and Norway setting it. But they managed an agreement with the Faroe Islands, but then Iceland demands or wants or requires a larger share of the total catch. So why is it so difficult? this is the question that we also try to look at. And I think, going back to those pointers that I said earlier, I mean, beyond international negotiations, and we could talk about Iceland and Iceland's dependency on fisheries. We can talk about Norway-Iceland relations, which is good in kind of the sibling way, a sibling that you perhaps struggle with at times, and Norway being the older brother who tends to, I guess, be a bit condescending. At least that's what I've heard the Icelandic people be seeing it as. But I think also what I mentioned earlier about the science, the disagreement on how to actually use science in setting these quotas and measuring the biomass seems to be a core issue. Maybe they've moved further ahead on that recently that I've not been aware of, but I don't think so. And then the domestic component. And I mentioned already the importance of fisheries in Iceland, the importance of fisheries in Norway, or at least certain parts of Norway, and the influence and sway that fisheries organizations have on politicians and on before negotiations, or when the negotiation or the diplomats have to take negotiations back home. I think we can't underestimate, which is a considerable part of this. So it really has been kind of the worst case, well, not worst case, it's been an example of impact of climate change on fishery management and the breakdown that has led to it. Not worst case perhaps, because the states still managed to agree on other types of quotas for other types of fish. You mentioned herring in your question, but they've managed to agree on this. And they agree in other aspects, I mean, as siblings do. But this mackerel has really been kind of a thorny issue. So I think there's more research to be done on kind of the international framework of the coastal state negotiations, and perhaps lessons that could be learned from this when they finally manage to reach an agreement. So. And sorry, just to jump in on the Svalbard hub, no, I'm not sure. I think that doesn't really relate to it, because the mackerel doesn't move that far north, neither does the herring. So Svalbard wouldn't really help that issue at all. Svalbard would be more related to snow crab and shrimp and cod, as I mentioned earlier.
Although I do wonder, beyond the tangible infrastructure that a Svalbard hub would create, if those types of conversations would have some sort of spillover to just create space for those type of conversations and to mobilize those maybe stuck discussions that haven't been moved forward over the past decade by having this new blood in sustainable Arctic fisheries. So maybe not, to be determined depending on your research. So I'm going to ask Ingrid to unmute yourself or come on video to ask Andreas your question.
Yeah, hi. I think my question actually relates to what you were just talking about, and you've already touched on this a bit, but I was interested in the connections between the question of fisheries cooperation and wider geopolitics in the Arctic. So how much kind of positive spillover do you potentially see from fisheries negotiations? I'm thinking especially about the collaboration between Norway and Russia, often being kind of talked about as a very positive example of how cooperation does happen in the Arctic, and that's especially in the Barents Sea. But do you see this kind of cooperation on fisheries also having an effect on wider geopolitical relations, or if not, other perhaps ways in which that could be facilitated, that opening up of space for discussion like you were just mentioning?
Great, thank you, Ingrid. From the beautiful town of Bodø, I saw you're in right now. Yes, I mean, good question. Geopolitics, or I guess in a way what you're asking, right, is, or I use this in one of my articles, and it's a very simplistic way of distinguishing the world, but high and low politics. And fisheries, by all means, has been categorized as low politics. I mean, not that low in this sense is a negative aspect, but like these smaller issues that might not reach the Prime Minister's daily briefing. Whereas high politics, right, the big questions, conflict with Russia, or what is NATO doing in the Arctic, etc. And it's questionable, right? The spillover effect between these levels. I've done some research myself on what you mentioned, Ingrid, the Russia-Norway relations, and I've looked at the Coast Guard specifically. So yes, okay, so you have the Joint Fishery Commission meeting once a year to determine quotas, and that might have a positive effect by all means. But it's the Coast Guard, the Norwegian Coast Guard and the Russian Coast Guard that have to go out every day and enforce the rules and regulations and inspect the fishers and talk to each other about, you know, discrepancies, etc. So that in itself, or at least when I looked at this, seemed to have some positive effect on collaboration between these two countries, on the practical level, on the low level, but also to an extent on, you know, the high politics security level, because both Coast Guards, or the Norwegian Coast Guard is part of the Navy, the Norwegian Navy, and the Russian Coast Guard is part of the border service, which is rather important in the Russia security structure. And the fact that these Coast Guards collaborated and then also were linked to, I guess, their respective domains back home in terms of security or military-wise seemed to have an effect. How do you measure this effect? Difficult to say, but it seemed to have a positive effect and to help keep things, if not calm all the time, but it helps us to provide a practical avenue to solve some of the small disputes that might escalate. And I think that might be the bigger issue, right? So when Norway goes out and criticizes Russia over certain actions in Ukraine or elsewhere, that's not impacted by the fishery relations. But a small issue in the Arctic where, say, a Norwegian Coast Guard arrests a Russian fishing vessel, that might escalate, that might, you know, grow into something that is suddenly a bit unmanageable or that causes friction. That seems to be well managed because you put in place these low levels of cooperation. So you're hindering kind of the escalation of issues. And then you have other issues in the Arctic that links fisheries and geopolitics. I mentioned snow crab. Let's not talk too much about the snow crab, but still, if you look at the EU's response to the snow crab issue, it's rather obvious that the European Commission has decided to keep this as a fisheries issue. It could, or it does concern the overarching issue of Svalbard, the status of these zones, various interpretations. You could even say, you know, Arctic governance. But the Commission hasn't gone there, and the European External Action Service hasn't gone there either. So they've kept it separate, right? Kept these different levels or different issues at different levels. And you can even argue the same about or in a different way about the moratorium, the 5+5 agreement that was signed, right? This is a bit of a different side of things, right? You managed to reach an agreement with these actors, China, South Korea, Poland, Japan, the EU, that are not Arctic countries, they're not Arctic states, but they have an interest in the Arctic. And, you know, when you talk about Arctic fisheries, we often talk about China having the largest fishing fleet in the world. You know, what might their interests be in the Arctic? And that's a legitimate question. But still, the fact that they managed to agree on a fisheries agreement takes a bit of the kind of the worst edge of that topic, because they reached that agreement a few years ago. So I think that also links to the geopolitics of it.
Great, thank you. And Andreas, I know you need to go sharply on the hour. So I just wanted to thank you so much for spending this past hour with the 22 people on this call from Colorado to Russia, and just being an incredibly informative presenter. I hope that this is not the end of the conversation for everyone here, but just the start, because you can join us for future webinars. We have about 10 planned over the course of the fall that you can register for at the link that I have shared in the chat and in our follow-up email. We'll be covering permafrost degradation, cultural heritage, planned retreat from coastlines that are eroding, how to collaborate with educators, and eventually we will be running an Arctic Winter College in January to April of 2021, where we will be covering all of these in a bit more detail that I hope you will be joining us for. We will be sending out an email tomorrow with a recording of this lecture up on YouTube, and Andreas's contact information for anyone who wants to follow up with questions that you were unable to ask here. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. Andreas, thank you for a great presentation. And I hope everyone has a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, Victoria. It's great talking to you all, and just get in touch with me if you have any questions. I can debate Svalbard and fisheries and the Arctic geopolitics all night long. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.